Chapter 14. The next morning, after eating a hard, dry breakfast, he patted the blanket over the bones and said, "Don't you worry, Lotus Lila. I'll get this son of a bitch." He felt such contempt for his enemy that he shot a deer in the heart of their country and roasted the loins and both hams. 3 days later, he met Wind River Bill close by the Yellowstone. Bill said he had been up to see how the woman was. He guessed she was all right. All winter he had felt powerful uneasy about her, for he had figured she would be dead hump ribs before spring. But doggone it, there she was, lugging water up the hill to her plants and sitting by the graves long after dark. Were the forest calls still on the stakes? Doggone if they weren't. Just looking round up there had made Bill feel as the Indians felt when old Belsey Dodd yanked his scalp off. Had some heard that one? Dick Wooten told it. Belsey had a head as bald as a buffalo skull after 30 winters in the blizzards. He covered it with a wig. One day at Bent's Fort, when a lot of sneaky Rapahoes were snooping around, Belsey rushed among the Indians, making loud and blood-curdling whoops and waving in all directions with his weapons. At the top of his war tantrum, he yanked his wig off and shook it at them. Every last redskin fled in terror because he thought that with one stroke Belsey had scalped himself. When Bill asked Sam what in the doggone creation he was doing with 4 new scalps, Sam told him the story. After staring at Sam, as a few days earlier he had stared at Kate, Bill reached for pipe and tobacco. Tamping tobacco into his pipe, he said, "You collate to exterminate the whole doggone nation?" Sam said dryly, "Only as many as I have time for." "Doggone it, Sam, you surely ought to reconsider. There must be 2,000 them crows, and there ain't a devil as hisses won't be after your scalp." "That's how I figure it," Sam said. "God Almighty," Bill said. He now was staring at 4 ears hanging on a leather string. "Cutting their ears off, Sam? Why, doggone it, you might as well cut their balls off. Ever see a wasp nest laid open?" "Many times," Sam said. "That's the way the whole Crow Nation will be. I surely think so. How many have you killed?" "Only 4, but I'm not through." Bill puffed his pipe and looked at Sam for half a minute. "Why for you cut their ears off?" "I want them to know you didn't do it. That's my mark." "Well, now, that's mighty nice of you, Sam. I surely wouldn't want them 2,000 devils after me." "Tell the truth now. How long you figure to live?" "About 50 years." Bill pondered that a few moments, his eyes full and incredulous. "Why didn't you tell the chief to send the killers out?" "I told Charlie to tell him, but he won't do it." "No, he never would. This is what he'll do. All 20 coups," Bill said, "would call all the braves into a big powwow, and he would say to them, 'Brave warriors, the bravest on the whole earth, 1 sleep, 2 sleeps is a bad one. Sleep he do not, and hate he do, and kill he do, like a ghost he is. A sharp knife he is, and his gun is sure as shooting. You gotta raise his hair. Let not the sun set, nor the moon rise, before this varmint is dead, and scalped and cut up in little pieces.' They would cut Sam loose from himself, they surely would. The chief would call for volunteers, and all the hottest bloods would step forth, eager to kill Sam Minard so they could wear an eagle feather as long as an elk horn. There was another thing that had just occurred to Bill that itched him like wood ticks on his Johnny. The Blackfeet, who already hated Sam, would be out to take him alive, so the squaws could squat all over him, dropping their urine and dung, and so they could ransom him to the Crows for 10 times a king's ransom. God alive, he could see 1,000 Blackfeet warriors after Sam. He surely could. Was Sam keeping in mind the fact that the Crows were the best shots in the country with bow and arrow? That in fact some of them could shoot straighter with it than most white men with a rifle? And there was another thing. Had Sam ever seen the way the Dakotas and Assiniboines hung from the ceilings of their lodges? They cut through the muscles on their backs and chests and pushed leather ropes through the holes, and by these they were lifted off the ground, and by God they hung there for days and nights, and you could hear their screams for miles. Yes, Sam said, he had heard about it. He knew that Bill was trying to suggest the hazards and horrors, but Sam didn't want his brotherly concern or any man's. He changed the subject. You think the woman on the mussel shell is all right? I surely do, Sam. She was wearing, Bill said, the same clothes she wore last fall. She looked stooped and seemed to be turning white, but all afternoon he watched her carry water up the hill. He expected that she was as crazy as a hoot owl, but would get along. He expected that she would live a lot longer than Sam Minard. Anyone heard of her man yet? Ner hair ner hide. He was gone beaver long ago. The Red Devils haven't bothered her? I didn't find a sign anywheres. Sam said, I expect I'd better go up and see what I can do. I have some things for her. When the two men parted, one to swim the Yellowstone and ride north, the other to go up the valley of the Bighorn, Bill put forth a hand, as Jim Bridger had done. He squeezed Sam's hand and said, Watch your top knot. What's yours, Bill? Before Sam reached the river, he surprised 2 crows chasing a bull buffalo and shot one off his horse. The other fled. Sam took the scalp and right ear. Well, now, he knew as well as Bill, or any man, that the chief would call his braves to a council of war. He would tell them that a terror was loose in the Sparrowhawk Nation. Sam thought that possibly the old chief himself, as brave an Indian as ever went forth to battle, might take the warpath, though it was more likely that he would choose 10 or 15 of his bravest and pledge them never to rest until the enemy was dead. Maybe Sam Minard's days were numbered. As the mountain men put the story together from Charlie and others, the chief took his medicine men into his confidence, and they agreed on the warriors most eligible for the honor. Because, like most primitive peoples, the chief counted by his fingers, the number he chose was 10. After a second powwow, it was raised to 20, but only to the shame and distress of every Crow brave. How absurd to think it would take 20 great warriors to bring down that clumsy and cowardly killer. The chief told them that any one of them could easily do it. Old man that he was, and full of winters, he could do it, but he wanted to give as many as possible a chance at the glory and 2 eagle feathers, for there would be 2. Hundreds of warriors had clamored to be chosen. The 20 picked for the glory were bold, but not equally bold, wary, but not equally wary, and skilled in hunting and war, but not equally skilled. Wily old 20 coups knew that no two warriors were ever the same. His plan, therefore, was to call on all the skills of his people. Night Owl had so assiduously aped his totem that he was known as the ablest of the night hunters. It was believed that in pitch darkness he could see as clearly as the owl. The chief knew this was not so, but it was good for his people to think it was so. Red Feather was possibly the ablest strategist among the younger men. He had the cunning of the serpent, the craftiness of the fox, the resourcefulness of the wolf. Wilwyn was, in the chief's opinion, the best tracker in the nation. He had such a powerful sense of smell that on hands and knees he could follow the scent of man or beast across Geest or a talus slope. Mad Wolf was a reckless one, and might be the first to die, if any were to die. Ever since his initiation into manhood, he had wanted to go alone to take Blackfeet scalps. Medicine Bird was an expert as any with bow and arrow, and had one of the fastest horses. Coyote Runs was the fleetest warrior in the nation. In a race of a mile or two over hill and down, there was no other brave who could touch Coup on his flying heels. Eaglebeak was of those men born and dedicated to the profession of killing. He had counted Coup at 17, and by the age of 22 had scalped 2 Blackfeet and 3 Cheyennes. The chief thought he had no warrior who could go in a straighter line to the enemy. Wolf Teeth was one of the most skilled horsemen in a nation whose horsemen were the best on earth. With only a foot and a hand showing to his enemy, he could, while his horse was on a dead run, hit an object the size of a man at a distance of 100 yards. First Coup was a sullen and grimly tenacious brave who, as a boy, had with incredible intrepidity repeatedly risked his life to touch an enemy before cutting him down with tomahawk and knife. Those were 9 of the warriors chosen. There were 11 more, all with special talents. 20 coups, the mountain men learned, called his people into meeting, and after the evil powers were propitiated and blessings invoked, he told the multitude that a dreadful killer, a paleface, and a mad dog had vowed to kill every sparrowhawk brave he could find. To justify his bitter malevolence, he was telling this absurd and outrageous lie that a party of braves had gone a whole moon down where the Little Snake flowed north and had killed the mad dog's wife and unborn child. His medicine men had told him that the Cheyennes did it, urged on by the Arapahoes, who lived on coyote bones and bugs. The Sparrowhawks had always been friends of the Palefaces, had fought side by side with them against their common enemies. This thing, this terror, was mad. He was the dog when it slobbered and drooled and clicked its teeth. He was like the hundreds who had flung themselves off precipices because their women and children by the tens were dying of the pale-face diseases. He left his mark as a taunt and a challenge by cutting off the right ear. They wouldn't go as a war party, the few who were chosen, but singly and alone. Every one of them would have an equal chance to bring the mad dog down. The one who brought in the scalp and the right ear would win 2 eagle feathers. The one who brought him in alive would be made a chief. If this mad thing lied in craven fear, if it crawled into a dark cave to tremble there like the rabbit, or for any other reason was difficult to find and kill, the chief himself would go forth and find him. The honor, the heroism of an entire people were at stake. All the palefaces from the great salt water to the big blue, from the mountains far north to the rivers far south, would be waiting and watching to see how long it would take for a sparrowhawk warrior to touch coup on this mad evil and bring its scalp in. Even while the old man was haranguing his people, a messenger came in with the terrible news that the Terror had slain another brave just south of the Yellowstone, and 2 days later had killed a war party of 3 as they sat by their fire. These bodies, like those of the 4, had been laid parallel with one another, their bloody skulls to the west, and from every skull the right ear had been sliced off. The chief was so outraged that his face turned the color of the red clays along the Yellowstone, and his old body trembled. But for the arthritis in his joints and the blindness in his eyes, sun blindness and snow blindness, he would have put on his war paint and gone forth. His braves were not what they had been before the white faces came with their diseases and firewater. He must have felt as all leaders feel when, looking sharply at their people, they sense in them a moral degeneracy that portends the end of the nation. He went ahead with the rites that would insulate the 20 warriors from harm. He personally saw that each of them had his medicine bag, his best weapons, and his choice of a horse from the large herds. At the encampment on Tongue River, he bade farewell to each of them as he rode away, alone, into the southwest. The braves were garbed in their most colorful raiment, with a long headdress streaming like a banner in the wind. They were 20 handsome young men, 20 of the finest warriors from one of the most remarkable of all the Indian nations, all dedicated to a single and irrevocable mission. Rarely in human history had 20 such superb fighters gone forth to bring down one man, every one a specialist in certain skills, every one hoping that he would be the lucky and famous one. Within a few weeks, news of the vendetta would reach trappers and traders as far away as the Rio and the Athabasca. Jim Bridger gave the news to old Bill Williams. Bill's long, thin, sunken face, looking as if it had been covered over with poorly tanned leather and was about to crack open in its deep, dried-out seams, turned unusually grave. His small, pale eyes, with the abnormally small pupils, looked into the north country, where at that moment he had no doubt Sam Minard, with naked knife, was slipping up to a crow. The wrinkled, bloodless lips sucked at a corncob pipe stem. He took the stem away from his broken teeth and said, "You said 20? Charlie says, the best in the whole doggone nation." "How many has Sam got so far?" "A few. I heard only yesterday he got the one called Mad Wolf." Bill sucked at his pipe a few moments. "Wonder if he'd like some help." "I reckon not. He figures to do it alone." "He just might at that," Bill said, and went on smoking. Jim Bridger at his post on Black's Fork had been telling everyone who came along what Sam proposed to do. He knew most of the men in the West, for he had been a partner in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and after that had been with the American Fur Company until he built his own post. Possibly no man in the West had a fuller knowledge of its mountains, rivers, valleys, passes, and trails. Thinking of Sam and the mad impossible task he had undertaken, Jim would recall that hour in 1832 when a red man shot an arrow into his back. The head of the arrow had remained in his flesh and bone for more than 2 years. It was then dug out with a knife by Marcus Whitman, a missionary to the Red people. Jim shivered a little when he thought of all the stone arrowheads that would be speeding toward the flesh and bones of Sam Minard. When Three-Finger McNeese came to the post and heard the story, he fixed one eye on Jim, while the other seemed to be looking off to the bighorns.
"You say he got Mad Wolf?"
"So I heard. In a hand-to-hand fight," McNeese said, "Sam was a match for any 5 red men and for any 2 white men, with doggone few exceptions. He was a holy rip-snorter. He would take care of himself unless they ambushed him or crawled up on him when he slept."
"Had the old chief put on his war paint?"
"They say he's clumped his horse for the last time. It's the young bucks trying to take Sam off the bay. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't," said Jim, who, like all mountain men, was a realist. "Today you were here and snorting with funk like a bull with his tail up, and tomorrow you were gone." If McNeese saw Sam, he might tell him that there was now a better rifle than the one he had, and the Colt revolver had been improved. As for the rest of it, the mort, the note sounded on a horn at the kill, would be ringing over the whole damn land. Did any man know where Sam was pitching his camp? Right in the bighorns, Jim had heard. After shooting Mad Wolf, while the reckless idiot was creeping up on him, apparently determined to make a coup, Sam had crossed the Yellowstone and gone north to see the woman on the Musselshell. He rode right up to her door, said, "How are you?" and in that moment observed that her hair had turned white. By her cabin he set food, buckskins, a pouch of flower seeds, and after staking his horses on the river bottom, he gathered stones from the area round about and piled them a few feet from the graves. He said he didn't know if she understood him when he spoke to her, or even if she listened. She had seen his wife last fall. Well, the crows killed her and the baby that was in her, and all he had now was their bones. He was going to build a stone cairn and put them in it. Having told her this, he waited, hoping that she would speak, but she was as silent as her dead ones. She was sitting between the graves with her Bible on her lap. On the river bottom this evening, Sam smoked and brooded and tried to see himself more clearly in life. Now and then he wondered if he was making a fool of himself. But when he thought of the vivacious Indian girl who had been his wife, and of the depths of his longing for a son, and when he contemplated again the bitter black cowardice of the killers, the old rage boiled up in him, and he was eager to be off to the warpath. The next day he laid the stones, chinking them with river mud. It was harder than he had thought it would be to immure the bones, to say farewell to them, to touch them for the last time. He guessed he was a pretty sentimental fellow. He wondered if the mountain men would have laughed if they had seen him pressing his lips to the skull of his wife, holding the skull of his son in his 2 hands, and pressing it to his cheek, and reaching in to touch them a last time before putting in the last stone. He looked over at the woman and her Bible, wishing that the bones in there could be blessed and delivered into the care of the great giver who had set the rainbow as a guerdon to innocence, wishing that Beethoven's choral finale on the Ode to Joy could be played softly forever and ever by this cairn and for this woman and her children. God in heaven, what a thin, unwashed, ragged, forlorn, poor critter of a thing she was, with nothing but her Bible and 2 graves. Life was a riddle. Damned if it wasn't. Less than a year ago he had been holding his darling close and dreaming dreams, and now both darling and dreams were entombed in a pile of stones. Less than a year ago he had been singing madrigals with the birds, and now he was on the warpath. A year ago this woman and her husband and children had been making the long trek to what they believed was fabulous land, an Eden or a paradise, their hearts and souls big with hopes and visions. And now 4 of them were slaughtered, and she was lost by 2 graves among 4 whitened skulls. It was not the father's fault if his children were damned fools who couldn't make decent use of the wealth and beauty he had given them, or get along with their neighbors. Perhaps the Almighty had long ago ruled that hour when he put Adam and Eve on a planet with larks and thrushes and mockingbirds, water ouzels and geese and squirrels and blue jays and the whole diapason of music, because all these things seemed so much more in tune with land and water and sky. Sam hoped that someday he would laugh again and sing and play his music. Someday, perhaps. Meanwhile, he had his own private war and a lesson to teach, as only killers could be taught. "I'm going now," he said, standing by her and looking down at her white hair. "I'll be back before long." He bent low to touch his lips and his fingers to her hair, and then he was gone. Kate didn't look up. She didn't turn once to look after him as he rode up the river and disappeared. Chapter 15. He was riding up a long mountain flank of aspen when he sensed it. At once he stopped to get his bearings. He didn't recognize this area, but a man couldn't know every one of the thousands of aspen hillsides. There were mountains south of him and across the southwest. He knew them by sight, but he was on a strange trail. All redmen, except the cricket-eating diggers and the fish-eating tribes on the lower Columbia, were experts in the art of ambush. It was in ambush that one small immigrant train after another was perishing. Turning, he rode back down the trail at a fast gallop. After 400 yards, he swerved sharply, and leaving the buffalo path, headed for a summit, hoping there to be able to overlook a wide area. In this he was disappointed, and so he sat, unable to see more than a few 100 feet, and sniffed and listened. The bay raised his ears to the direction from which they had just come. Sam was wondering what had warned him. There were so many things in nature that give signals. The kingfisher, red-winged blackbird, wren, bittern, chipmunk, ground squirrel, magpie, crow. The wild world was full of them, and a man had only to learn their ways. Something had told him that he was in the presence of an enemy. Because he had hidden his pack horses and was on a very fleet horse, he chose one of his favorite stratagems. He would make a run for it until he found a spot he liked, and so, going at full speed, he descended from the summit and took another path, his eyes looking for a hill with jutting ledges. His was the cougar's trick, which he had observed 3 separate times. The cougar, or panther, or mountain lion, usually stalked his prey at their watering holes. If the hole happened to be on a stream that flowed close to an overhanging ledge of stone, the beast would crouch on the ledge and wait, and when the animals were drinking, he would leap to the back of deer, antelope, elk, buffalo, or wild horse. Leaping to the shoulders, he would sink his claws deep into flesh, and at the same moment reach for the throat with his long, powerful teeth, and if it was one of the smaller beasts, he might, with a swift movement, seize the head and wrench it backward, breaking the neck. Sam was looking for a vantage point where he could leave the path, leap off the horse, and advance swiftly to meet the enemy. After 2 miles of forcing the bay at top speed, he saw it. The trail rounded a hill. Barely past the point was a forest of trees. Rushing off the path, and 100 yards into the woods, Sam leapt down, and leaving his lathered beast to recover his wind, he ran forward and stood behind a tree. He wasn't surprised when no Indian came in sight. He now hastened through the woods and up the hill. On hands and knees, crawling swiftly, he went forward to a bluff above the path and looked down. Back there on the trail, 200 yards, was a Crow warrior, the paint on his face glinting like gold in the noon sunshine. He sat on a tall sorrel pony, looking and listening. Having no doubt that this was one of the 20, Sam watched him through a lattice of leaves. He could have shot him off the horse at that distance, but on thinking it over, he decided to walk out in plain view and give the man a chance. The moment he was in full view, he gave the Crow war cry and raised his gun. But he didn't fire. His sharp eyes were watching the enemy's movements. It seemed to Sam that the redskin was deaf or paralyzed. He would have sworn that for a full 10 seconds the fool sat there, his black eyes staring at the giant who stood 100 feet above him and 200 yards away. Sam could imagine how the eyes shone with a gem of light in their center, and the tenseness of the clutch on the gun and of the thighs clasping the pony. Suddenly the Indian came to life and brought his rifle up. In that instant Sam fired and the pony fell. Almost at once the red man was on his feet. Again, with electric suddenness, his long rifle came up, but Sam had ducked down and backed to reload. When ready, he shot up into full view, and the Indian's gun in that moment exploded. In the next instant, Sam fired and saw the man stagger. Sam dropped to his knees to reload. Knowing that this young warrior had momentarily lost his nerve and fired widely, Sam doubted that he was one of the 20. More likely he was a green youngster who had taken a gun and slipped away to find glory. Running to his horse, Sam mounted and rode into the forest above the bluff. The pony was dead, and the warrior had disappeared. There was nothing to do but watch and wait. If, as Sam imagined, this was a youngster eager to cover himself with honors and an eagle feather, he was alone. But if he had been scouting for a war party, the 3 shots would bring it in. While waiting, Sam wondered if he wouldn't soon be weary of this night and day stalking, if he should have gone to the old chief and demanded the right to meet the killers, or if he should have gone back to his people for a visit. He had considered all these alternatives and rejected them, reconsidered and rejected again, for the reason that all the red people were fantastic liars and cheats. Anyway, the chief would have sworn by all his dead ancestors that none of his braves was guilty. There was still another matter, Sam told himself, as he sat in tall grass, looking out and down. The Crows were now claiming broader lands than they had ever occupied, all the country that bordered the Musselshell on the south and east. This included the woman and her graves and the cairn. So far as Sam could tell, it included lands claimed by the Blackfeet. If these implacable enemies, with their age-old feuds, were to go to war, they might, when their blood got real hot, murder the woman. If they did that, half the mountain men in the country would march against them, and there would be enough blood to turn a river red. If there were only good trapping spots close to the woman, he would live there and watch over her, and some day take her back to her people. But there were no good beaver ponds within 200 miles of her. While looking down at a dead horse and waiting, he also dwelt on the fact that warriors from other tribes would now try to capture him, knowing that the Crows would pay a fabulous price for him. Windy Bill had been emphatic about this 2 weeks ago when they puffed their pipes after breakfast and drank black coffee. Sam, he said, would look worse than a stillborn child in a putrefied forest after they were done with him.
Old Jake Moser's nephew he had trapped on the Healy. Well, now, the Comanches had wanted him, and so the Rapahoes they caught him, and when the squaws were done with him, you couldn't at tell if he was man or coyote. Some people, they were good at one thing, like sailing the sea, and some at another, like being a lying politician. But the Indians, they were the best on earth at torture. Bill could just see the squaws slavering as they looked at Sam. He surely could. If Sam were fool enough to let the Blackfeet take him alive, they ought to open his skull to see if there was anything in it. "I don't figure they'll take me," Sam said. "Had any man ever who was taken? Sam, I wish you would think it over. I surely do."
Bill had proposed that 20 mountain men should ride into the Crow village on the tongue and demand the murderers from the old chief. They would tell him that if the killers of Sam's wife were not handed over, the mountain men would bring the Blackfeet and the Cheyennes against them, and the Sioux for good measure. Sam had refused to consider the proposal. This, he felt, was his own private feud. He felt that no life but his own should be risked. "Doggone it," Bill had said. The Blackfeet would be trailing Sam day and night. As for himself, he'd rather face a grizzly or 10 bitch wolves than a Blackfeet squaw with a knife in her hand. Sam hoped that the Blackfeet wouldn't be on his trail, for he had dreamed of spending a winter in their beautiful country, of hibernating during the months of December and January, like the bear, of eating and sleeping and communing with the Creator's infinite, while playing a few themes from Corelli and Bach and Mozart, of enjoying the pure heaven of being alone, far from policemen and tax collectors and all the parasites who made up any government. Bill Williams had once said, "There actually were damned fools who spent a good part of their time in wanton romping with women, and other damned fools who thought it the supremest pleasure to stand at bars swilling gin and rum, and still others who thought the good life demanded a neighbor within 30 feet on either side." Nearly all the mountain men agreed with Bill. They were all rebels. Convinced after 2 hours that no other Crows had been in the area, Sam went down to the horse. It looked like a very ordinary pony, but you never could tell about an Indian pony. A trail stained with blood led away to a thicket. Warily, Sam followed it and soon came to a man lying on his face, stone dead, or a youngster, Sam saw after turning the body over. Not 18, perhaps not more than 16, a good-looking boy who had slipped away and gone forth to take Sam's scalp. Poor dead young one. He had a rifle so old that it looked like one the first voyageurs brought down from Canada, and a stone hatchet with a broken handle. For a full 5 minutes Sam looked down at the brave youth, thinking that his son would have been much like him. He didn't take the scalp or cut off the ear. If he had had a shovel, he would have buried this brave kid. If there had been stones in this area, he would have built a cairn. The most and the best he could do was to heave the body to the fork of a tree, 8 feet up. There, on its belly, the corpse hung down, both head and heels, but it would be safe from the wolves. The old musket Sam tied to the tree just below the youth. If the crows found this dead son, they would know that Sam had hung him in a tree, and they would know why. But there was something that they would never see and never know. It was in Sam's face and eyes after he had gone 50 yards and had turned to look back. Chapter 16. His killing of the Crow boy chastened his male aggressions a little, but 2 days later he killed Wolf Teeth without knowing who the man was, and a week after that he killed Coyote Runs. He sensed that he had an unexpected advantage in the fact that the hot bloods sent out to get him were competing with one another and taking foolhardy risks. It was while thinking one day of the pathetic form hanging grotesquely in the tree that Sam recalled an experience that had haunted his dreams. It had been 2 years ago. He and 2 companions, looking for beaver ponds, had surprised 6 Blackfeet warriors riding down a ridge. Because members of this tribe had recently killed one of their friends, they gave the mountain man's dreadful war cry and charged. Their first 3 shots toppled 3 redmen from their ponies. Reloading while they raced after the survivors, they fired again, aiming at the horses because of the distance, and the 3 beasts stumbled and fell. 2 braves leapt up and fled. The third had a broken leg and was crawling away like a wounded badger when the white men overtook him. The Indian then struggled up to his sound leg and drew a knife. An expert with a bowie, Sam at that moment had hurled his blade and knocked the Indian down. Leaping from his horse and rushing to the fallen man, Sam had drawn the knife out and plunged it through him in the region of his heart. Gouts of blood had spouted from the wounds and from the mouth and nostrils. Sam had then raced after his companions who were pursuing the 2 Indians. They lost them and returned to the dead horses. 15 minutes passed before one of them looked over at the warrior with the broken leg. His cry of amazement had brought Sam to his feet. The man through whom Sam had twice driven his knife had managed to sit up, even had managed to find his knife, and there he sat, a hideous figure, his whole chest red with the gore that streamed down from his mouth. The thing that had held Sam's attention was the Indian's eyes, staring at him through a red mist. They were filled with the deadliest hatred Sam had ever seen. But even more terrible to look at than the eyes were the hands, washed with warm blood and trying to feebly close nerveless fingers around the handle of a dagger. After a few moments the Indian had made a chilling sound as from agony, mixed with the choking gurgle of blood in the throat, and as blood burst in a red vomit from nose and mouth, the head sank forward and the body and the warrior was still. There was nothing in a man that Sam admired more than courage. More than once since that hour, Sam had awakened from a dream about this man and had been too disturbed to sleep again. More than once he had been troubled, as now, by contemplation of man's or beast's helplessness before an enemy. Nothing else in life went into him so deep, or with such pain and pathos. Nothing else drew from him such a cry of pity to the Creator. Man to man, or beast to beast, when both were in fighting battle, was one thing. To be helpless before a merciless enemy was another thing. He knew, he never for a moment forgot, that the Blackfeet tortured their captives with fiendish ferocities that few white men could have imagined. It was true that no one could believe without having seen them. How savage the squaws could be! Were they mothers? Did they feel tenderness when cradling their babes? How was a man to reconcile such hellish cruelties with a courage, sometimes a valor, that brought cries of admiration from their enemies? Around campfires during the long winters, tales were told of the red people's nature and doings, such as the wager between a Sioux and a Cheyenne, both from a war-loving people. They had met unexpectedly one day, at a time when their nations were not at war, and the Sioux had challenged the Cheyenne to a game of hands. In this simple game, one of the two players took a small pebble, and putting both hands behind his back, clasped the stone in one of them. Bringing his hands into plain view of his opponent, knuckles up, he asked him to choose the hand that held the stone. This was a favorite game with Indians. They were such inveterate gamblers that they would wager everything they had, including their horses, weapons, women, and sometimes their lives. The Cheyenne won everything the Sioux had, and that brave, sitting stark naked and wondering what else he could wager, offered his coveted scalp. He wagered it against everything he had lost. It was the wily Cheyenne's turn with a stone, and behind his back he took so much time changing his mind and moving the stone from hand to hand that his opponent cried out with impatience. Suspecting a trick, he demanded to see the stone, for sometimes a brave's medicine was big. The Sioux took the stone and examined it. He could see no erosion caused by magic, but asked nevertheless that a bullet from his medicine bag be used instead. It was the Cheyenne's turn to suspect a trick. He stared hard at the piece of lead as he turned it over and over in his hands. Though it looked all right, he tested it with his teeth, and he smelled of it. His sly mind was telling him that the Sioux was dull and unimaginative and could be deceived. And so he kept the piece of lead in his right hand as he examined it, and it was still in his right hand when he put his hands behind his back. It was still in the right hand when, after 5 minutes of anguished searching of his wits and his magic, the Sioux said it was in the left hand. The Cheyenne had guessed that the stupid fellow would get hooked by the notion that the bullet would be slipped over to the left hand. Without the slightest trace of fear, the Sioux had folded his arms across his naked chest and bowed his head. Without the slightest feeling of mercy or pity, the Cheyenne had taken up his knife and stood above him. With his left hand he seized the long hair and pulled the scalp taut, while with his right he cut through hair and skin to the bone, all the way around the skull. If the Sioux flinched, the Cheyenne didn't see or feel it. The customary way of scalping, both red and white, was to put a foot on the prostrate enemy's neck or face, and with a powerful twisting jerk snap the scalp off. The Cheyenne, without benefit of foot or neck, had to snap the top knot back and forth, and at last, with a swift movement, jerk it off. The Sioux rose to his feet, blood streaming down over him. He had seen men scalped who lived. He knew that his skull would heal, but that forevermore he he would be a bald and disgraced one. He wanted vengeance. So he demanded that they meet again for another game of hands after 2 moons. Feeling immeasurably superior, the Cheyenne readily agreed. He foresaw another triumph. He stipulated that they should bring to the rendezvous their finest horse and their finest weapons. They would meet on Owl Creek at its headwaters in 2 moons. All the time the two were making their agreement, the Sioux stood with blood streaming down his front and back, and the Cheyenne openly admired his bloody trophy, which he held by the long hair. They met again in 2 moons, the Sioux's skull as bright and smooth as sun-baked bone, the Cheyenne unable to keep the gloating out of his face. But either luck or cunning was against him this time. He began to feel, after several losses, that his opponent had stronger medicine, and with all the magic taught him by the wise men, he prayed for and strove to summon, in moments of intense concentration, a power that could defeat the bald, eager man who kept guessing right 4 times in 5. But he lost his horse, his weapons, and every piece of leather on him, and he sat as his opponent had sat 2 months earlier, stark naked, with nothing left to wager but his scalp or his life. If he had wagered his scalp and lost, the Sioux would have been satisfied. But the Cheyenne, like his people, was a proud, haughty one. Besides, he now thought his magic was working, and so resolved to wager his life against everything he had lost, and everything the Sioux had brought with him. The impassive Sioux accepted the proposal. The Cheyenne lost. That moment, Sam had thought many times, must have been about as intense and electric as any moment had ever been between 2 enemies. How many white men would have run for their lives? The Cheyenne merely stood up and faced the Sioux. Had he begun to chant the Indian death song? The story said only that the bald Sioux faced the Cheyenne and drove his knife through the Cheyenne's heart. It was a man's country out here, and not for tall boys called men. Sam had never known an Indian, and had never heard of one who had begged for mercy. Mercy was not a word in their language. A white captive who begged for mercy, and most of them did, aroused in their captor such contempt that they couldn't devise tortures fiendish enough to degrade him. Every mountain man knew that if he were luckless enough to be captured, the only way to face the red people was to hawk phlegm up his throat and spit it in their faces. They might then torture you, and they certainly would kill you, but they would admire you, and they would treasure your scalp. Sam looked squarely at the fact that he might be captured some day. Few white men in Indian lands had lived to be as old as Caleb Greenwood and Bill Williams. Twice captured by the Blackfeet, and twice escaping from them, Jeremiah Flagg had said, "I expect it's time for the old coon to get back to his tree." He said there had been a time when he could smell a cussed redskin 10 miles toward nowhere, but now couldn't smell him unless he could see him. It was terribly beautiful country, covered with violent life. The beaver was a gentle fellow who lived on bark. The milk givers ate leaves and grass, but the flesh-eaters were all killers, and man was a flesh-eater. Sam had observed that most of the flesh-eaters were savage in their love-making. A favorite with some of the red people was the soup dance, in which the men and women in 2 lines faced one another across a distance of 30 or 40 feet. A girl would coyly advance with a spoon of buffalo or mountain sheep horn filled with soup. This she would offer to the man of her choice and quickly withdraw, with the man pursuing her until she reached her line. He would then retreat, dancing to music, and she would come again, and still again, and from those watching there would be laughter or hoots of derision. When white men participated, they substituted kissing for the spoonful of soup, but the Arapahoes, with whom it was said the dance had originated, rubbed noses, though now and then a couple would try kissing and seem to like it. The girls sometimes, but not always, wore a hair rope chastity belt with the ends tied around their waist. A story was told of Kit Carson in one of these dances. A huge French bully had proclaimed himself the favorite and guardian of all the more attractive girls. Half drunk and with his lusts boiling, he had chased a girl into an adjacent woods, and after catching her, had been so eager that he had slashed with his knife back and forth at the chastity belt, opening deep wounds in the girl's thighs and belly. She had then drawn a hidden knife and stabbed him and run away. According to the tale Sam had heard, Kid then challenged the bully to a duel, killed him, and took the girl, Singing Grass, as his mate, changing her name to Alice. Sam had learned that most of the flesh-eating males were brutal to the females. Possibly the cats, big and little, were the most ferocious of all, though no more cruel than some of the men, red or white, when filled with passion and rum. The way his lotus trembled under his touch during the first days had told him things he had never read in books. The red lover was sometimes worse than the male bobcat. At one of the posts during trading time, Sam had watched drunken braves mating with their women, had seen a Cheyenne cover one of his wives, and then, in a senseless fury, stab her repeatedly with a long knife. He then embraced her a second time after she was dead. Weariness with killing had turned Sam's thoughts to love, and to John Coulter's hell. Why not spend a winter there? He could go deep into that steaming and exploding area, and no Indian would dare follow him, for they thought that evil spirits were working their magic there. They thought a geyser spouting its boiling breath 50 or 100 feet into the sky was an especially large devil showing off his powers. All the tiny, hot-mouthed poutings were, Sam supposed, the puckered lips of little devil babies. It was a fearful land tucked away in the basins among densely forested mountains. No buffalo were there, but deer and elk were, rabbits and grouse, and ducks and geese on the lake. He could build a fire without having to feel anxious, soak himself in hot pools, eat hot food, play or sing, and think of his wife. He could study the loveliness of coruscant glitters and winkings of light in a coppice when a breeze was on it, and the empyreal elemental fires in the sunsets, and the fugues as choirs of birds sang around him. If tax collector or policeman or political boss ventured in, he would chuck him head first into a big boiling mud pot. Yes, he would go there to recover his poise and nourish his powers. But first he would go up to the woman to see if she was all right. He wished he could persuade her to come with him, for it chilled his bones to think of her alone in another winter, under the howling megalomania of the Canadian winds and the wild sub-zero blizzards. The mountain men might even move the graves down there, where she would always have heat and hot water and shelter, and lifelong security from her enemies. Chapter 17. He rode by night through Crow country, and 4 days later sat astride the bay on a hilltop, looking first at the cairn. Then he saw the woman sitting between the graves. God in heaven, would she spend all her life over the bones of her dead? Was this a typical mother? Before her tragedy imploded into his being, he had never thought of the differences between the human male and female. While looking over at this lonely woman and thinking about her, he recalled a dream about Lotus that he had dreamed many times. She had lain naked on his thighs and belly, as though on a big thick mattress of meat, her chignon of black hair snuggled against his throat, a slender bronzed hand reaching up to play with his beard. His beard had lain down over one side of her face, like a covering of horse mane. She had liked to run fingers through his whiskers and yank gently at the hair over his chest. Possibly, he had thought, because red men were so hairless. Then she had moved up through hair to his mouth and had kissed him. Now, looking over at the woman, he felt a surge of tenderness. In memory, emotion flowed in lightning heat all the way south over the path they had taken, and to the cabin, and to the pitiful armful of bones that was all that had been left of the vibrant thing he had loved. He was hungry for woman, but he had no hunger for the woman with white hair sitting by the graves. If she was anything for him, she was a mother image, or female with little one's image, like the grouse with her lovely darlings, or the female mallard web-footing it across a lake, with 7 or 8 soft little balls of fluff and down in her wake. This was a large, soft hour for Sam Minard, goose-down lined, geyser warm, antelope eye gentle, mountain lily white, and tender as he looked at the woman. Sentimental softening of his will and senses had not moved in such a deep current since he had reached in to touch the immured bones, his soul enfolding all that remained of one who in his dream of her and his plans for her would have been wife and mate and straight-shooting warrior at his side. Sam then rode off into the hills. Had this woman learned how to jerk flesh, catch fish from the river, dry wild fruits, or did she sit there the whole time, except when bringing water to her small Elysian garden? Suspecting that he knew little about the human female and her ways, he tried to summon a clear image of his mother and of other mothers he had known, in their pattern of living. His mother had worked hard for her children, and work was about all she had had. This woman had time, and that was about all she had. She would have years and years of time, and she would grow old there and die, and like his wife, be eaten to her bones by wolves and ravens. He returned with 2 fine deer, gutted but with the hide still on, and went over to the shack. The woman had seen him coming, and now actually looked over at him as he drew near. Bill had learned her name, and now all the mountain men knew her name, and so Sam said cheerfully, "How are you, Mrs. Bowden? How have you been this long time?" Dismounting, he untied the deer, and taking each by a hind and foreleg, laid them on their backs, open bellies up. Looking round for stones to prop them, he saw that the northwest skull was not the one he had put on the stake. He walked over to have a look at it. Some mountain man had killed and beheaded an Indian and had brought the skull here. "Looks like they're watching over you," he said when he returned to the cabin. Because she had risen to her feet, he went over to her. He simply stared at her, and she stared at him. After a few moments, his gaze moved over her face, and he saw that it was starvation-thin, and down over her body, noting the details of her garb. On her feet she had the tatters of a pair of shoes. Her ragged dress looked to him like the one she had worn the first day he saw her. Her hair hung in uncombed snarls. Her face and hands looked as if they hadn't been washed for years. He went over to a pannier, saying, "The crows don't have feet as big as mine. Maybe some of these will fit you." He offered them to her, but she didn't take them. Again he looked at her eyes. He had never seen such eyes. He hadn't known that in human eyes there could be such glittering and chilling lights. Something like horror ran along his nerves as he looked into Kate's eyes and saw that they had no memory of anything, not fenced in by this river and its hills. He went to the door of the shack and looked in. It was bleak with the first chill of autumn. He turned to look at her plants. She had quite a garden of sage and wild flowers, but the flowers were now withering in the freezing nights. Facing her again, he said he wished she would go with him to the region of Billings, where she could be warm in any kind of weather. He and Bill and some others could take up her loved ones and carry them down there and bury them by the hot waters of a pool, and she could have a much lovelier garden almost the year round. But he knew after a few minutes that his words weren't entering the small bleak world where she lived. He sensed that in strange ways, that he would never understand. It was a wonderful world where a mother lived with her children and the angels and God. He framed her thin, tired face with his big hands and lightly kissed her forehead and her hair. "I brought you some things," he said, speaking cheerfully, doubting that she would understand a word. From his pack horses he took sugar, flour, coffee, salt, raisins, a roll of buckskin, inside of which were pepper, needles, thread, matches, a roll of cotton cloth, inside of which were pencils, and a notebook and a buffalo robe. "Here were pencil and paper," he said, holding them in full view of her stare. He thought she might like to write letters back home. Every time a mountain man came by, she could hand the letters to him, and he would give to her the mail that came in for her. Sam had had the notion that she could be won back to a sense of the realities if she were to write and receive letters, but he knew, good Lord, he knew that she was far below that or above it. He dressed out the meat, jerked most of it, roasted one tenderloin for himself and the other for her, and the next morning turned back upriver. He hadn't gone far when he stopped to think. Why would a woman, even a mad woman, carry water all day long up a hill to water such a plant as the sage? Concluding that there must be a mystery in it, he decided to go back and spy on her. What did she think about all day long? What did she dream about all night? The pile of wood he had laid by the south wall she had never touched. All around the cabin there was no sign that she had ever made a fire. She had never brought river mud to daub the hut. She must have almost frozen to death during the past winter, when temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 below zero, and winds colder than ice smote the walls. The more he thought about it, the more incredible it seemed that she was still alive. On his way down the river, he searched the bottoms, but found no spot where she had dug for roots, no berry bush from which she had taken fruit. Hiding his beast in a thicket, he went up the hill and turned north. Approaching behind one juniper and another, he drew within 60 yards of her and sat to make himself comfortable and to observe her and wait. Peering between cedar branches, he had a good view of her and her yard. She was sitting. It looked to him as if she was sitting between the graves, and she seemed to be talking, but he couldn't be sure of that. The sun was sinking. It would be dusk soon, and then night, with a full moon 2 hours before midnight. How simple it would be for a Blackfoot from the west, a Big Belly from the east, or a Crow from the north, to slip in here and take her scalp and everything she had. He knew that redskins must have been tempted to the verge of frenzy. He knew that only fear of mountain men vengeance stayed their hands. It had become a law of this country that if the red men of any tribe were contemptuous or brutal toward any mountain man or any person whom mountain men were protecting, word of it would go forth all the way to the San Juans, the Big Blue, and to Oregon's Blue Mountains and beyond, and a summons to a rendezvous and vengeance. The vengeance would be so dreadful that survivors would turn gray with fear and flee to the remotest hills. Sam thought it unlikely that any buck would ever be fool enough to take the scalp of this defenseless woman. Because the wind was coming his way down from the Bear Paw Mountains, he filled and kindled his pipe and breathed in the aroma of Kentucky tobacco. There was nothing much to see. She just sat there, and an hour passed, 2 hours, and she still sat, as though waiting for something or someone. When deeper dusk came, he could barely see her. In the breeze moving over him, he could smell her and the shack with its big pile of unclean bedding. He could smell the bleached bone odor of the skulls and of all the deer bones mountain men had scattered round about. Putting his pipe away, he went on a wide detour and approached from the north. As she sat, she faced the south by southwest. Taking his time, he slipped forward until he came to the shack on the north side. He then peered round the northwest corner. There she sat, between the bones of her children. He looked back to the hour when he had buried her loved ones. He saw the scene again and knew that her daughter's grave was on her right, within reach of her hand, the grave of her sons on her left. The riddle was why she spent so much time there. For an hour Sam watched her, and she didn't move half an inch either way. He sensed that she was waiting for something, but there was nothing before her that he could see, except a dozen sage plants that she had brought from the river bottom, and scrub juniper farther out, and the night dark of river trees. About 10 o'clock, the moon came out of mountain dark. It looked like a round piece of cardboard with pale paint smudges on it, but it cast a lot of light. He saw that at once there was a change in the woman. She moved a little and seemed to sit a little higher. She took something up from her lap, and then, to his utter amazement, she began to speak. Like a man who now found himself in a strange, eerie place, he glanced round him and up at the night and listened. Her back was to him, but by the way her arms moved he knew that she had something in her hands that she was looking at. Her voice was surprisingly strong and clear. He heard the words, "The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them." Straining forward, he heard, "The Lord meant you, and you, John, and you, Robert, the wilderness and the solitary place, all around us here. It is for us." All this is glad for us, my darlings. You make it more pleasant in the sight of the Lord. John, my darling, Robert, my darling, and my darling daughter, do you all hear me?" Sam heard her. He was rigid with astonishment. The moon had risen the height of 4 tall men in the sky, and Lou and John and Robert, in the cocoons of their moon-grey sages, were nodding softly, like flowers, and smiling with heavenly radiance, like a silken halo around them. Sam advanced from the corner and stared and listened. In his wonderment, he now realized that this woman had some education. He thought she had the accents of a schoolmarm, but he could see nothing to talk to. Soundlessly he advanced until he stood just behind her, and his amazement grew as he stared and listened. "We are in the wilderness and solitary," the woman's voice said, clear and strong. "We don't have much, but we've always been poor people. All our people have been poor people as far back as anyone knows. But our Lord, he said to his disciples, 'Blessed be ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are ye that hunger, for ye shall be filled. Blessed are ye that weep now, for ye shall laugh.'" "Almighty God," Sam said under his breath. On her right, the image of her daughter, so delicate that it seemed to have come from subdued light and the softest kind of cloud silk, moved as the breeze moved, and nodded gently, and bowed like flowers, and smiled and listened to her mother. And on her left, the 2 sons, looking like pure soul divested of all its dross, smiled and nodded. Sam stared until his eyes ached, but could see only the sage and the withered flowers. After an hour he slipped back to the north side of the cabin, and there he pinched himself to be sure that he was not asleep and dreaming. Looked out to the distant hills like piles of night dark, at the tree line of the river, at all these to see if they were still familiar, for he was feeling uneasy and queersome. Everything looked as it had always looked, except this woman. He now returned to his position behind her, and looked down over her head to see what was in her lap. Never would she know that this tall man stood almost touching her, and stared at her grey hair and at the Bible in her hands. His eyes searched the earth before her and the plants, but except the plants and the woman and the cedars and the river trees he could see no sign of living thing. To her dear ones and her darlings she was now saying, "Repeat after me the words, 'Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men.'" She told them that most men seemed not to want peace, but mothers wanted peace for the good of their children. Sam strained his ears, but could hear only her voice and the flow of the river and the cries of night birds. He saw that here and there in the book she had put slivers of paper. She would lift pages, 50 or 100 at a time, and move from one slip of paper to another, and then pause to read. "For ye shall go out with joy, and be let forth with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing." A little later she was telling them that the Lord called on the heavens to sing, and the earth to be filled with joy, and all the mountains to burst with song. She was saying, "Until he comes, we will be solitary in the wilderness." Sam slipped 50 yards out into the night, so that tobacco smoke would not reach her, and filled his pipe and smoked. There had been strange music in her words, strange soothing caress, as of a wild mother's hand. He didn't want to let this tenderness go from him. The mountains and the hills would break into singing? For him, the earth had always been singing. Here in these mountains were fugues, arias, sonatas, that thousands and millions of them, interweaving the harmonies of one another. And there was the other side of it. In Thomas Hood's lines, there is a silence where hath been no sound. There is a silence where no sound may be. There was that kind of silence in the pathetic youngster hanging from the tree crotch. Suddenly there came to Sam an impulse to get his organ and at a distance from her, unseen and unknown, play soft music. So he went to his baggage and returned. And lying on his belly behind a mound of earth, with a night breeze moving across him and toward her, he made low musical tones, while wondering what he should play. His instrument wasn't generous enough for Bach's organ music. The things that flooded his soul were the love songs he had sung and played for Lotus. Have you seen a white lily grow? He played that. He played a tender Mozart minuet, the soft notes floating away on the breeze to that dear mother's ears. Almost at once she began to sing. The sound of her voice in mezzo-soprano song was so electrifying that for a few moments Sam was put off his music. He could only listen in astonishment and gaze up at the night sky, knowing that the Creator had a hand in this. The woman didn't move or turn to look round her. He thought she was singing hymns. He began to improvise, mixing snatches from serenades, chorale phrases, the themes of thrush, lark, and warbler, in a pleasing assonance all his own. After a while he understood that what he played didn't matter at all, as long as it was in harmony with her mood, the moon and the night. With her back to him, she was singing to her children, and Sam was playing softly to the stars and his mother and Lotus. He kept the notes low, for he didn't want to alarm her. The whole lovely thing would have been shattered if even a faint suspicion had broken through her mind. He blew out just enough music from the mellow horn, bird arias, the theme so often repeated in Beethoven's violin concerto, and other musical tidbits to keep her singing. For 2 hours or longer she sang in a fair soprano with a marvelously clear bell tone now and then ringing from her throat. And the moon rose to the zenith, and 1,000 stars came out. When at last Sam slipped away into the night, he wondered if his playing had been a kindness. If there was no music tomorrow night, the next night, and for weeks or months, how would she feel about it? Well, doggone it, he would return as often as he could to play what she surely must think was heavenly music. She would hear it, and she would sing to her children. Deeper happiness than that there was none for mothers anywhere.